All right, so we'll begin. This is a rather intimate, we have full house, right? I'm happy about that. We have a rather intimate setting, so we don't need the microphones, and we'll try to speak up. I do want to invite Maureen, the head of the Taulawi International School, to say a few remarks. She's the mastermind behind this and all of the week's many fun activities planned. So Maureen, please, maybe you want to introduce and say something to welcome us all.
Of course, welcome everybody. It's really a pleasure. 8 months of work to get to this point of hosting the USA Week. That's officially starting now. I want to thank all of you for being here, especially the conflict resolution students. We know that we're kind of taking your slot of your course today. We hope it's going to be really interesting. So thank you, Odi, for enabling this and our great collaboration with the Center for American Studies for everything we've been doing. And I'm sure it will be a very, very interesting panel. Thank you also for those who are joining us through the live stream. So many people wrote to me that, especially due to the rain, they're going to watch us from far, which is great because otherwise I don't know where they would sit. So hopefully it's going to be a very interesting panel. Thank you for joining and enjoy the week and join us for all the other events.
All right, great. So, thanks everyone for coming. What we'll do, I think we'll discuss in the panel for about an hour the election results, and then we'll open it up. I know a lot of people here have questions, and this is informal, and we can have a Q&A. So we'll just do that in about an hour. I want to briefly introduce the panelists. I'm Yoav. I'm a faculty member in the Department of English and American Studies, and I head the Center for U.S. Studies here. We have my esteemed colleagues here, Professor Sommer, who's a professor here in political science, an expert on the Supreme Court, American legal system, American political system, and elections. We have Dr. Naama Maor from the history department, who is an expert on family, on the history of children, on the relationship of law and society and gender. Thank you, Naama. And we have Brandon Friedman, Dr. Brandon Friedman, who's the director of research here at the Moshe Dayan Center for the Study of the Middle East and Africa, and he's an expert on the American relationship with the Middle East and the Arab world, and he'll certainly give us a very important, I think, foreign policy perspective. So thanks, Brandon, for joining us. And I want to begin. I think we've had a week to process, right? Have we had, I think, more than a week?
Almost 2 weeks.
Almost 2 weeks. So for those who've been able to process, and some who can't, we'll try to maybe make sense of everything here. And my initial question, I think, to get this discussion going is, if every panelist can maybe, in one word, I want one word, reaction to try to describe, what you feel or what you think in reaction to what happened, right? And I'll just say about myself, I want to say relief, not that any one candidate or not won, right? Not that Trump won or not, but relief that it's over, right? Because it's so terrible. And, if you're in the United States, the debate was so ugly and so disrespectful and misogynistic and, and divisive and polarizing. So I think I'm happy it's behind us. Now we'll see what's going to happen. But I wonder what my three colleagues here, your reactions to what happened, if in a word, and then explain it. Please, Udi.
So if it has to start with R&E, so I will say realignment, rather maybe in addition to relief. So I think, it's not something that happened in 2024. I think realignment in American politics can definitely be called the Trump realignment. Usually when we think about realignments in America, it's associated with a certain president. So maybe FDR, maybe Reagan, and certainly Trump started in 2016 and continued in 2024.
So, if one word, I would say alertness. Alertness. I think you described a sense of relief that the campaign is over. I think my word talks more about what is
coming.
Exactly, what we're predicting and what we should be prepared for. So alertness is probably...
So vigilance.
Exactly.
So that's the glass half empty. The glass, certainly the empty part of the glass. Brandon, please.
I guess expect the unexpected. So that's 3 words, sorry.
But what do you mean by that? That you expected this to happen, or?
No, I think just everyone's going to ask what our predictions are, what we anticipate happening. And I was saying to Naama before the panel started that, predicting a Trump administration is a bit of a fool's errand because he's such an unpredictable character himself. And so we're going to have a very serious discussion, which I'm really looking forward to, but I would bear in mind that we should all expect the unexpected.
But in that sense, are you optimistic or cautious, or I think Naama is quite frightened if I read in between the lines?
I think as a historian, I'm trying not to prejudge it. We used the word misogynistic to describe the campaign, which is accurate and a good word. But here we have Susie Wiles as his chief of staff, right? So the glass ceiling has been broken, the first woman ever to be White House chief of staff. So on one hand, we have this misogynistic narrative about Trump, and on the other hand, we have Susie Wiles in the White House. So as a historian, I love that, the paradox there, and the contradictions, and I think we should expect a lot more contradictions moving forward.
So certainly if we learn anything about Trump is that nothing makes sense. In a way, that's the chaos, and he says that. That's his thing, the chaos theory, that everything you think you knew about American politics, American government, I'm going to disprove it, right? And that's part, I think, of the revolutionary, the anarchistic almost kind of sensibility that he has. All right, so I want us to go back then to what, 10 days ago, 11, 12 days ago, to try to make sense of what happened, right? To make sense of the election results, to try to understand them. And right, and Udi mentioned realignment. And if each and every one of you had to put there's never one cause for anything. In general, if anyone teaches you in history that one thing caused something, then don't listen to them, right? It never works that way. It's always a convergence of events, but if I'm going to contradict myself now, but I want every panelist to put your finger on one important thing that you think helped, determine the results of this election. And again, we know it's not just one thing, but there's a few main currents, and certainly, Udi, you talked about realignment. You want to maybe tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's true for every science. There's no one cause for anything, in the social sciences and in the natural sciences. So that being said, I think that, the fact that Trump was able to break what was considered the Obama coalition or the Democratic coalition of, young people, LGBTQ, minorities, and women, and be able to attract both people who are, prominent figures with a public image in America, and more importantly, if you want to win elections, he was able to get the crowds to vote for him, right? He was able to get the masses from those different constituencies, not everyone, but good numbers. And if you look at the way things progressed between 2016 to 2020, and then between 2020 to 2024, it did not start 2 weeks ago. It's something that he has been working on and has been able to achieve over the course of those 8 years.
So who are these voters that jumped ship and kind of abandoned the Democratic Party? You mentioned the Obama coalition, in a way coming apart gradually since 2016. Do you want me to say something about your own research?
So in 2016, we know that it was the blue-collar white people, right? They used to be the base of the Democratic Party, and they are, when you think about what is the base of the Republican Party now, this is the base of the the Republican Party. So that's a huge shift. This is realignment, but another type of realignment, and this is, where is Idan? Is he here? Idan, he's a shy guy, but this is work that, so Idan came to me, I think about 3 years ago, and he said, listen, the numbers don't add up. If you look at the way minorities, I have my 6 minutes now, right? Okay. So the numbers don't add up. Everybody says that minorities vote for the Democratic Party, that they're a part of this coalition, the Obama coalition, the Democratic coalition. But if you look at the numbers, you look at 2016, first of all, Trump did pretty well then among Latinos, among African Americans, among Asian Americans, despite everything that he had said during that campaign. And then if you look at 2020, there was this, intervening 4 years when he not only spoke but also did stuff, right? He had certain policies, separating families in the border, talking about the Kung Fu virus. I mean, if you think about every minority group in America, Trump did something and did a few things and said a few things that on the face of things should have made them move away from voting for him. And even then, Idan came to me and said, listen, the numbers are such that he's actually making gains in those constituencies. And everybody read the news about what happened 2 weeks ago, and we all know that this trend continued. Okay, so first of all, just at the level of description, okay, and then I'll show you some of the numbers now, okay. If you look at these are votes for African Americans, okay. So these are the numbers for 2020. We don't have them for 2024 yet, but it's more extreme in 2024. Okay, you have on the right hand you have Biden, just African American voters. On the left hand, you have just African American voters voting for Trump. Okay, and the clear difference is that with Biden, almost everybody is a registered Democrat. Okay, so Biden is able to attract the people that of the African Americans, that people we would expect him to attract. Okay, but look what Trump is able to do. Trump is able to, 1 out of 5. Okay, 20%. 1 out of 5 African American voters casting a vote for Trump actually are voters that are registered as Democrats. So he's able to attract people from the other side. He was able to do it in 2016, more so in 2020, and even more so in 2024. These are the numbers. So the first one was the African American constituency. Second one is the Asian Americans. Okay, the Asian Americans, these are the numbers that compare the percentage of voters between 2016 and 2020 in some of the major Chinatowns in America. I know that we are blocking the numbers of the Chinatowns, but look at the numbers, okay? In Houston, 28% more, the vote for Trump was 28%, so 28% of the people shifted towards Trump between 2016 and 2020. 22% in San Francisco, even those small numbers, okay, 7% in Oakland, New York, etc., okay? These are the hubs of the Asian American community, certainly the Chinese American community. And the support for Trump, this is November of 2020, okay? Think about what he said in March and April of 2020 about the homelands of those people, okay? Especially China, of course, okay? With COVID. And this is still in COVID, okay? Deep into COVID. And look at the numbers, okay? And for Latino, this is another, I'll just move quickly, okay? This is New Mexico, so this is an example for 2020, but I guess Miami-Dade is a good example from 2024. If you look at the numbers, okay, about 65% of the population are Latino. For the most part, Democrats always used to carry that county. 2024 is the first, so DeSantis is able to carry that in the last time that he's elected governor of Florida, and he goes crazy about that. Trump carries the county in 2024, okay? And we know that the shift among Latin American men is over 20%, okay, from 2020 to 2024. Okay, so that's the description. In and of itself, that's something that is that flies in the face of everything we thought we knew, okay? But beyond the descriptive level, the reasons are at least as surprising, okay? So, because what would be the argument? The argument would be Americans vote because they like his ideology or because economy was great under Trump, okay? So that's why they vote for him. So even though, you know, they would you know, hold their noses, and despite the fact that they don't like how he talks about Asian Americans or about Latinos or about African Americans, he's conservative enough. He appointed those 3 Supreme Court justices. They overruled Roe v. Wade. They overruled affirmative action. He advances the conservative agenda. Great, I will vote for him, despite the fact that he said those things about Obama, or despite the fact that he talked about the Kung Fu virus, or despite the fact that he said that all Mexicans are rapists, okay? But what we find is very different, okay? What we find is that, you know, the ideology is important, of course, and we find that economic performance is important. People thought that economy was doing great under Trump, okay? Or at least those people that thought that economy was doing great were motivated to vote for him. But this is where our another place, okay, where everything we thought about, everything we thought we knew was at least partly wrong, okay? Those people who voted for Trump among those minority groups voted for him not despite what he said about minority groups. They voted for him because what he said about their own groups actually was in line with the way they perceive their own groups, okay? So Clarence Thomas, the Supreme Court Justice who voted to overrule Roe v. Wade, but more importantly, who voted to overrule affirmative action, is not such an outlier, okay? What we thought we knew was that he was an outlier, right? He was the exception. There's hardly any African Americans that think that way about what it means to be black in America. Turns out that there's many more, there's millions more who think that way, and even more importantly, those millions are located in the swing states. So the shift that we're seeing is happening even in a way that is more pronounced and is happening earlier because of this minority. For Latinos, the Latinos that voted for Trump are not Latinos that are appalled by the fact that by the way he talks about immigrants. They actually, if you look at their sentiments, they have a strong anti-immigrant sentiment. Okay, they agree with him in the way he thinks about their own community, and something along those lines for Asian Americans as well. So I don't have the time to describe everything, but what basically, just to summarize, okay, the realignment happens both at the descriptive level, where you see those constituencies moving away from the Democratic coalition and into the Republican coalition, whether it's sustainable, where it's going to last beyond Trump. These are good questions, but it's happening right now. And the other place where this is completely surprising is the reasons, the underlying reasons, okay? The liberal progressive agenda that was supposedly the one that was able to understand those groups actually missed big time. And Trump, with his intuition, he's not based on research, right? We know he doesn't read this stuff, okay? But based on his intuition, was able to really tap that sentiment and capitalize on it and get those voters to move over to his side in 2016, more so in 2020, and even more so in 2024.
So thanks, Udi. And this is right part of Udi and Idan's research, and they have a very interesting article that I'd urge you to read if you're interested in this realignment question. I wonder if Naama and Brandon can maybe comment on this question of, the end of identity politics, this idea that demography was destiny, and, the idea that the Democratic Party thought that, African-American voters and Latino voters are, they have them in the bag. They don't have to actually address their issues because they're going to vote for them anyway. And I wonder what you two think about this idea that Udi presented.
So I'll continue with, similarly to what Udi just said. I think you were describing the Obama coalition. You're also describing somewhat the creation of the Trump coalition. As historians, we can also go back to the New Deal alliance and try to figure out the origins of the creation of the backing that the Democratic Party had. So in a sense, you're describing why people gravitated towards Trump, and we can also ask questions about why people were distancing themselves from the Democratic Party. And I think that when we talk about identity politics, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that a lot of the times we project our expectations on different minorities or different groups. We expect them to vote in a way that we think they should vote as women, as African Americans, as Hispanic voters, as Latinos. And when we look at the turnout, and we look at the exit polls, we see that we don't really understand what motivated people, whether it was the economy, whether it was women's rights, or whether it was reproductive rights. And I think that one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that these different groups are not monoliths, which goes to what Udi was talking about right now. And I think that we also have to keep in mind that when we look at our history, I mean, just as much as in the 1970s when women were fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment, we had a similar coalition of women who were fighting against the Equal Rights Amendment. And we can take our lessons from that same history and try to figure out what it is that draws these women to sometimes more conservative ideologies than we would expect them to possess. I think as a historian, I don't like to make predictions, but I like to draw on the past. But I'll go to the near past, and I'm going back to 2016. I was in the United States during the election, and I remember that some of the takeaways that people had from the elections were, one, it will take a very long time for a woman to lead a party again as the party's candidate for presidency. And two, that the results of the elections would probably galvanize women, and not only women, and we'll see a wave of political activism. And we did see that in 2007, we did in 2017, we did see that in 2018. And here we are in fast forward 8 years, and we're in 2024, and there is a woman who ran for presidency, and the most unexpected turn of events that we could probably if it were scripted, it would probably be rejected. by Hollywood producers, just a turn of events that led to Kamala Harris' run for presidency. So in that sense, we don't really know how long the public also had to, I mean, we know that they had 107 days of a campaign to process what Kamala Harris stands for, what the Democratic Party is going to look like right now. Recently, and I'll just finish with a small anecdote. Recently, one of President Obama's former staffers, John Lovett, was asked a question about the difference between writing a speech for Obama and writing a speech for Hillary Clinton. And he said with Obama, there was always an expectation for a narrative. You have to know where you're going with that speech. You have to tell a story. And with Hillary Clinton, she was so spot on all the policies. She knew everything. She had knowledge of every piece of legislation and who supported it and who didn't. And that's what you had to keep in mind as you were writing her speech. And in that sense, when we look at the two different campaigns that we saw now, the Kamala Harris campaign and the Trump campaign, Trump tells a great story, not a fun story to listen to most of the time, but he tells a good story for the forgotten man who feels forgotten again. And he tells a good story for people who feel that they were left behind by the Democratic Party that was supposed to be their party. And with Kamala Harris, what we mostly saw was a list of programs and plans and initiatives and policy initiatives that didn't really coalesce into a story, into a narrative, into a question of what the Democratic Party would do for different groups within the American public. Right, and I think that was part of the problem.
So, right, so this question of form and content and all substance, I'll shine no substance, right, in a way. And that's modern politics, certainly in the age of TV, and certainly in the age of Twitter. And in a way, Obama and has much more in common with Trump, right, than Hillary, who's a superb politician, knows everything and would have probably made a great president than someone like Trump, who admits he doesn't read the briefings. He admits it. But he's much more intuitive, but he's a brilliant politician in terms of campaigning, right? And you see here I think Naama is pointing to a very big difference between governing and campaigning. And we are living in an age of a permanent campaign when all that matters is that campaign. And therefore, the fact that Kamala Harris really did command policy in an excellent manner, it didn't matter. It didn't matter because she couldn't get elected, right? Brandon, do you want to talk about the election results themselves?
Well, look, all of my fellow panelists are far greater experts than me on sort of explaining the results, and I was asked to talk about some of the foreign policy issues with respect to the Middle East, and I'll do that in a second, but I just want to, at the risk of sharing an anecdote.
We love anecdotes.
For whatever it's worth, I was in the U.S. during the election. I was there last month. And I was also there in 2022, and I have 3 children. The price of a box of Cheerios in 2022 was $5. Last month it was $10. For those of you who don't buy Cheerios in Israel, that's double the price of Cheerios in Israel. I think a lot of people felt the cost of living issue and were punishing the incumbent administration. Now, I know Yoav and Udi warned us about monocausal explanations. I'm right there with you as a historian. But I think that many voters who voted probably went to the polls thinking about what the administration had done for them in terms of their daily existence. And a lot of the things I'm going to discuss were certainly not in the forefront of their mind.
So do you want me to talk about what role did foreign policy have, if all, or maybe it didn't have a role, or were you surprised by the role of foreign policy in these elections?
Well, I think part of the Make America Great Again idea, and really this is the key question, I think, in terms of thinking about Trump in the Middle East and even in the world, is does it mean restoring America's power and position in the world, or does it mean retreating into a sort of an isolationist sort of, we're going to focus on issues at home and sort of let the world is on its own, so to speak. And I think that's a core question, and the answer is unclear. and it was unclear during Trump's first administration. Will Trump seek to deter America's enemies in the world, or will it seek to appease them? And in terms of how that played into the election results, the issue of Ukraine, the issue of China, and obviously in the Middle East, the issue of Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran. Is Trump going to end American wars? Is he going to exacerbate rivalries and conflicts? Or is he going to try to extricate the U.S. from them? And obviously, these are dichotomies I'm presenting, right? And it's never just either or. It's always somewhere towing the line. And I think it behooves us, if we're trying to figure out what Trump may or may not do, to look at his record. What did he do as a first-term president? Now, for Israelis in Israel, it's Trump delivered. He was good for us, right? That's the general perception. He moved the embassy and recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. He recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. He brokered the Abraham Accords. And for those who thought that the nuclear deal with Iran was a weak one, he abrogated that deal and took the United States out of it. And so in a very superficial, simplistic way, if you're looking at it from Israel's point of view, then Trump was very good for Israel. Now, I think there's a much more complex story to be told about Trump's role in the Middle East. The way Trump embraced the Saudi regime, which ultimately led to a blockade on Qatar, which ultimately fragmented a potential unified front against Iran during the first administration, an abrupt withdrawal from Syria and Iraq, which terrified American partners, and obviously the idea that America was attacked repeatedly by Iran in 2019, specifically in May and June, and in fact a surveillance drone in June 2019 was down. American AWACS plane surveillance drone was down by the Iranians, and Trump didn't respond. To many, smelled of weakness. But of course, then in January 2020, Trump ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, who had been basically the architect of Iran's expansion in the region for a decade. And so there's this mixed bag. Was Trump sort of weak when he was confronted in the Middle East, or did he respond with strength? Another anecdote would be in March 2020, there was a price war over the price of oil between the Saudis and Russians. And ultimately, Trump threatened to withdraw all American military support for Saudi Arabia if they didn't stabilize the price of oil, because the price war was destroying the American oil and gas industry, many of whom are big Republican supporters. And Trump issued that threat, and MBS, the Saudi day-to-day ruler, backed off. So the story about Trump in the Middle East is actually quite confusing and complex. And so you don't know which Trump you're getting, which is why I said expect the unexpected. He was unpredictable. In some respects, people saw him as unreliable. I think when it comes down to making or looking forward in terms of Trump's policy in the Middle East, there are two issues we should probably talk about more. One is the Biden administration pursued, and some people say it was a factor leading up to October 7th, Saudi-Israeli normalization, which is really a Saudi-American defense pact at the heart of it. Many people feel that Trump will pick that idea up, probably modify it a bit. And what does that mean for Israel, Israeli security, and Palestinian statehood? That's a conversation worth having. And finally, I think ultimately, Trump is going to be judged by his ambition to confront Iran, to re-implement maximum pressure, and to address the nuclear issue. And what will a renewed Trumpian maximum pressure policy look like? I didn't think the maximum pressure policy of Trump was particularly effective, with the exception of the Soleimani assassination. So we'll have to see what happens. But I would say that the story, if you're looking for a simple one, is not there. That really, when you drill down and examine Trump's record, it's quite contradictory, complex, and confusing. And so many have said, well, we have a record of what Trump's done in power, and we can learn from it. And there are at least 10 memoirs of former Trump officials, only in the national security realm, who have written about their experience with Trump, and I don't think it clarifies things at all. So thank you.
So I want to, a lot of people emailed us, and of course I know it's not the only elephant in the room, but of course this question of Israel. I don't want to reduce it to is it good for Israel or bad for Israel, but at the end of the day, I think that's what many of us are and were thinking, right? And I think Brandon gave us one response to that. I want to ask the other panelists, if we could reduce it to that, waking up on, when was the 6th of November after Trump's surprisingly easy victory, I have to say, how do you feel in terms of Israel national security? Are we better off, or this is for both Udi and then Naama? I know Brandon addressed that.
You said we woke up, but we were surprised to see the results. There was a certain point where after we coordinated this panel that I wasn't even sure we'll have the results by the panel. The truth is we don't know, or at least I don't think that I know. I'm not sure that I know how to define what is good for Israel. I mean, the question is for a lot of people when they talk about what is good for Israel, it would be financial backing, it would be military backing, it would be allowing Israel carte blanche to do whatever Israel wants. I wouldn't necessarily consider that good for Israel. I would expect an ally to also be critical of Israel and to also be there to help us direct ourselves in new directions. And you know, here I join Brandon in his assessment that we should expect the unexpected. And with Trump, we can really say that the most unpredictable things can transpire. So I want to know.
What are your thoughts about this?
So this is a very complicated question. So none of us knows. None of us knows the future. But I think, I think moving the embassy to Jerusalem had a huge symbolic message and meant a lot to the vast majority of Israelis. I think recognizing the Golan Heights is also pretty much a consensual. It's in consensus. But I think the main issue that I have with the first Trump administration in the fact that there were big political moves that where they were glossing over the details. And if you think about, I think Jerusalem is symbolic and the Golan Heights is also symbolic to me. Not that symbols are not meaningful, they're very important. But the two things that I think are clear in terms of political moves are the Abraham Accords and the Iran deal. And I think for the Abraham Accords, in 2020, we all thought, wow, this is unbelievable, right? They completely shifted the paradigm. Instead of having, the Palestinian issue be a necessary condition for any kind of progress with any of the Arab countries or any of our neighboring countries, they shifted the paradigm, right? We can throw the Palestinians under the bus and we can move forward with deals, with regional deals.
The deal of the century.
The deal of the century. Trump was, and then again, that's about glossing over the details, right? When you're a real estate mogul, and you are going to buy this huge compound in Manhattan and turn it into a co-op, you can gloss over the details. And many people who bought real estate from Trump will tell you the details were glossed over, okay? But when you run, and when you bring somebody brilliant like Jared Kushner, who's going to, reshuffle the...
I'm not sure brilliant.
I think he's brilliant. I think he's brilliant, but so I'm not saying, October 7th happened because of Sinwar, and it happened because of Hamas, and I'm not trying to take away any of the responsibility of those ruthful, those terrorists and all the hideous things that they did. Okay, but I think the fact that the big picture was not considered and the Palestinian issue was basically glossed over in the Abraham Accords. I think this was a major flaw in that initiative. So that's one thing. And about the Iran deal, here too, we think what's good for Israel. In Israel, there was unanimity among all the leaders of the Mossad, the Shabak, the IDF, that the deal was good for Israel. Okay. And the fact that the deal was basically revoked in 2018 First of all, it's against the professional opinion of those people in Israel, and it's not just one generation of Mossad leaders and Shabak leaders and heads of the and heads of the IDF, but it was several generations that were in one mind on that. But beyond that, if you think about the Soleimani strategy and the fact that right now, if you follow the earthquake in Iran, that these are not earthquakes, right? The Iranians are probably running, nobody knows exactly, but they're probably running to get nuclear capacity. Now, beyond getting nuclear capacity, they need to put it on missile heads. There's lots of technology hoops that they need to jump through. It's not the end of the story, but the fact that the deal is gone, okay, and was gone in 2018 during the first Trump administration, has already had implications for the degrees of freedom that the Iranians have in the Middle East and might have even more severe consequences. So again, this glossing over the details, when you do those things, you need to be a professional. This is your responsibility. You're the leader of the free world. The lives of people and the survival of nations is on your shoulders. This is your responsibility to make sure that those things happen the right way. And in order to do that, the devil is in the details. And if you gloss over those details, things happen. And I think, and I'm just hoping, that in the second Trump administration, Brandon said that, he's not sure where they're going to go. It depends. You'll get one answer if you ask the vice president-elect. You'll get a very different answer if you ask the Secretary of State, the designated Secretary of State, right? They'll give you very, very different, two poles of what America is going to do, not just can do, but is going to do in the Middle East. I'm just hoping that whichever way it goes, those who are responsible for that are going to do it very responsibly, much more so than in the first term.
So I know Brandon wants to respond. I just want to say, unfortunately, just looking at the new administration, it hasn't, right? He hasn't filled up all the posts, but certainly Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, right? A few of the head of the National Intelligence, CIA. There's many things there. Professionalism, not one of them, unfortunately. And this is important because that's the point, right? And here I'll just say, you have to understand Trump's victory and the Trump phenomenon is the delegitimacy of the American elite, the American establishment class. That was the point. That was the point in 2016, because for many Americans, that was Trump's case. Why is he now appointing a Fox News host? He's appointing him because he says the generals, they don't know what they're doing. He says that about Milley, right? The former chief of staff, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That's his whole point. It's fundamental. We talked about populism, anti-elitist, but enough Americans share the sentiment, and unfortunately for good reason, that America's elite class has failed them, because they failed them in Iraq 20 years ago. They failed them in Katrina, right? They failed them in 2008, the financial crisis. And that's Trump's whole point. And the New York Times and the mainstream media, they were a part of that failure. So that's what opens the door and facilitates Trump's whole challenge to the establishment, because the establishment did fail, right? Sorry. Yeah, Brandon, you wanted to bring us back to the Middle East and the Palestinian issue?
I wanted to go back to your original question, which is sort of what's good for Israel. And I want to try to give the answer I gave before the election, which was, in my estimation, what's best for Israel is a strong United States. And so, to me, one of the fundamental questions about Trump is what he does with the American system of relationships, partnerships, alliances that exist. That, to me, is the true source of American strength, its ability to marshal such a broad tent of partners across the world. And it seems that one of the Make America Great Again ideas is that those partnerships, alliances, relationships are somehow less important. And that fundamentally, in my estimation, weakens the United States, and I don't think that's to Israel's benefit, broadly speaking. Now, how Trump deals with his alliances and relationships moving forward, we'll have to wait and see. I think I certainly don't want to prejudge that, but I think, broadly speaking, what's good for Israel is a strong United States, because I think it's Israel's most important relationship in terms of its foreign partners. Two more quick comments. The personnel issue it's important. And, early on in the transition, it tends to get everyone's attention. It makes for great gossip. We study all the characters. We look at their track records. It's one of those things it's fun to do, right? But I think one of the lessons, at least reading through the memoirs of the Trump officials from the first administration, is that is perhaps we put too much stock in our analysis of some of these officials, that at the end of the day, Trump is the most important personality in this story in terms of the details or the big picture. And so I think that I would just make a cautionary statement regarding, if we look at the personnel, someone like Marco Rubio, I sort of see as an establishment figure, right? So on one hand, right. And he puts that out at Secretary of State, which if you take the comment I made a minute ago about relationships, partnerships, is perhaps an encouraging sign. But of course, there are a whole other group of appointments that might neutralize or cancel this all out. And I think that's part of the point of how Trump operates. And so I would just be caution. I would exercise caution in terms of putting too much stock in the personnel decisions. Ultimately, I think Trump likes to think of himself as the decider and tends to marginalize those who want to take away that role of decision maker. And finally, with respect to the Palestinian issue and the Abraham Accords, first of all, I want to remind everyone that the Abraham Accords were sort of a consolation prize from the failure of the Trump administration to broker what he called the Prosperity for Peace, his sort of the Trump peace plan, which he presented in June 2019 in Bahrain. The Palestinians rejected it even before the Bahrain conference, and it went nowhere. And it was really the Emiratis who, with Israel, came to Trump and sort of proposed this Abraham Accords. The Emiratis made lemonade from lemons. And I think that if you look at that story very carefully, it was simply salvaging a botched Trump foreign policy initiative. And if we look at Barak Ravid's book, for those of you who haven't seen it, in Hebrew, Hashalom Shel Trump, Trump's Peace in English, it appears in both languages. One of the interesting things that appears in the book is Trump's frustration with our current prime minister, who he felt was using him with respect to Iran to support Udi's take on the Iran deal, and he was critical of our current prime minister for not being interested in peace, and because Trump felt he was really trying to broker a peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And so for those who might anticipate that Trump would try again in terms of a Middle East peace within the framework of what had been started by the Biden administration in terms of a Saudi-Israeli normalization that could prospectively include Palestinian statehood, I would just keep in mind those Trump-Netanyahu dynamics, because I think that Trump, again, has gained some experience from his first term in office that he might use his second time around.
A few more things I want to talk about. Just on that point of Israel, I want to maybe be an optimist. A lot of people are pessimists. Some of you are almost fatalistic, right? And a lot of my students are like, oh my God, the sky's going to fall and everything. What's going to happen now? But I want to offer a point of optimism. Trump, I don't know if he'll do it, but Trump has the power that no American president in modern history has had to force Israel to do things it doesn't want to do. And I stress this because the relationship between the United States and Israel has always been very rocky, ups and downs, certainly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But even Republican presidents, who we usually associate as being much more pro-Israel, they did not have the power to prevent Israel doing things that Israel did when it thought it was in its national interest. And this goes back to Nixon, certainly Eisenhower, but the relationship wasn't good then. But I'm looking at Nixon, at Ford, right? Ford had a huge crisis with Israel in 1975. He wanted Israel to do certain things in terms of withdrawing from Sinai. He couldn't get the Rabin government. This was Rabin, the late Yitzhak Rabin was prime minister. He couldn't get them to do anything. Nixon can get Golda Meir to do these things. Reagan can get Begin to do things in the early 80s when he wanted to. And these are very powerful Republican presidents. And Trump is more powerful than all of them. And I'll explain why, not just politically at home, but because Trump has leverage over Israel and the Israeli right and Netanyahu, I think, that no American president had. Because like George Herbert Walker Bush, the first Bush, when he told Shamir to do certain things, Shamir they were very resistant about the Madrid conference and things like that. And so even they didn't have the power to get Israel to do things that Israel thought was against its interest. Trump has that power. He has political power in Israel over the Israeli right. And for me, at least, if there will ever be, maybe there won't be, but if there will ever be a solution, Trump actually has the power to do that, right? That was the optimist in me. I want to come back to America now, and we need to talk a bit maybe about the Jewish vote, right? And Udi, I know we talked about this. You were looking at some of the numbers. A lot of people thought there was going to be a great realignment because of the protests, the campus stuff at Columbia and everything. Did we actually see any? How did that affect the Jewish vote?
So the person to ask about that is actually Raphael Kreuzer, who is going to present this afternoon, if you still have appetite for American politics, at 4:15. No, he'll be here at 4:15 for another panel similar to that. So because he actually looked at, at something that looked at big data, looking at Twitter. I'll say a few things about the Jewish vote, but I just want to say something about. Okay, I'll talk about the Jewish vote. We can talk about Trump some more later. I'll give just one insight. Okay, I think after October 7th, there's a sense in the Jewish world, right, that all Jews are in the same boat, right? We experience things that are not the same but are related, right? Jews that live in Israel obviously experienced October 7th and the war that's been raging since. Jews who live in Europe, Jews who live in America feel anti-Semitism, anti-Israel sentiment. They experience violence. They feel threatened. But I think the elections show that, despite, I'm not trying to argue that is not true. Okay, there's a sense that if you travel overseas now, when you meet with people from Jewish communities overseas, you feel things. You've always felt there's a lot in common. You feel much more. You feel a common fate now, right? People feel that that there's really something profound that changed after October 7th. That being said, if you look at the election results, we see that in surveys that were done in Israel, if Israelis could cast a vote in America, 70, 80, 90%, depending on the survey, would vote for Donald Trump. Okay? If you look at the actual results in America, the patterns that we had known for several election rounds now remained largely the same. They always talk about this county in New York. Fine. Okay? But for the most part, American Jews voted 70-30, 69-31, whatever, for Harris, just like they had voted for Biden. Okay. Now, I think maybe less about the American Jewish community and more about the relationship between Israel and that community. Okay. There's clear that despite the fact that we feel that we're in the same boat, and that October 7th really was a watershed event in the history of the Jewish people wherever you live, whether it's in Israel or in the diaspora, I think the results of the elections show that there's still a lot of things that we need to work on, a lot of bridges to build, a lot of differences to first of all maybe flesh out and then think about whether we want to work about changing those things or not. But the sense after October 7th that we're all the same is just simplistic, I think. Okay, there are fundamental differences. And that's something that's going to be a challenge, I think, for Israel, for Jews, and for the relationship between Israel and the Jewish diaspora in North America, but it's probably true, similar in places in Europe.
You guys want to say something, Naama, about were you surprised or not surprised about the nature of the Jewish?
I wasn't. I can't say that I was surprised, and I think I know similar, statistics to what Udi was describing. I do have a question for you, if you don't mind, and that is, how do we kind of calculate the generational differences, or how do we assess the generational differences within the Jewish vote? It seemed like throughout this year and throughout the campaign, we're talking about different older Jewish Americans who would probably be more supportive of Israel, and would probably be more aligned with whoever would be more favorable for Israel or would be perceived as more favorable, whereas younger American voters who are Jewish would not necessarily think of their Jewishness as their identity that they are moving forward in the world with. So I wonder.
So I spent a little over 3 months in America from August until a few days after the elections. I met with quite a few Jews there, and I guess the way to organize that is around questions that really trouble the community. Okay, and I guess there's two questions that I can mention here briefly. Okay, I think it's obviously would warrants a longer discussion. One of them is about Jewish power. Okay, after October 7th, Jews in America, in Israel, I don't think it's pretty clear. People feel that we need power, right? It has been a question even before 1948, certainly since the foundation of the state, and certainly after October 7th. But in America, it's a complicated thing. It's a complicated issue. Okay, some Jews feel that, what's the meaning of Jewish power? How much power do you need to have? What type of power? How do you exercise that power? Should you exercise that power? So these are questions and I think different generations understand that differently. And the other big question is the Jewish tent. Who's in the Jewish tent and who is outside of the Jewish tent? Okay, and that's again something that different denominations within Judaism would understand differently, and different generations would have different answer to this question. Certainly, the younger generation would think of the tent, I think, as much more permeable, right, and than the older generation. But again, there's differences not just between generations broadly defined, but within the different denominations. But those two questions about Jewish power, one, and the Jewish tent, the other one, I think, are ways, are organizing principles that if we want to understand what American Jewry has been going through over the past 13 months, I think these are two major themes to think about.
And just to add to that, right? Remember, it's not just a question of who's in the Jewish tent, who's a Jew? That is fundamental to a lot of American Jews today. When we look at polling, this is true about Pew and Gallup, the more comprehensive ones, over a third of American Jews, they identify secular, right? And a lot of the polling, exit polls, they ask you, what's your religion? So it's also very difficult for us, when I'm asked about the statistics, actually, it's very difficult for us to know who's Jewish in America, exactly because of all these definitions. Is it a religion? And for a lot, it's not a religion. Then if they're secular, they don't necessarily identify as Jewish. So that's also, I think, very interesting.
Yeah, but Pew has pretty good estimates for that.
Yeah. Brandon, you grew up in the U.S. Do you want to maybe address from a personal point of view?
Yeah, maybe I'll say two things. First of all, this is probably the first election where, and again, it's anecdotal, so I don't know how much you can really make of it, but the people I know and talked to about this election said they are voting on the issue of Israel amongst the Jewish community. And the way a lot of people in the U.S. often are one-issue voters, whether it's Roe v. Wade or the economy, whatever that particular issue is, over and over again, I heard Israel being the reason they would vote one way or the other. And I also heard a lot of criticism that Biden didn't, criticism of the way Biden supported Israel during the war since October 7th. Which to me, which was interesting, if I'm talking about foreign policy and a potential, how Trump pursues his Middle Eastern policy, there was a lot of people who would, I think, traditionally vote Democrat almost instantly, who felt that the way the Biden administration supported Israel during the war and the way Harris was talking about Israel during her brief campaign was troublesome for them or problematic. And I also think that there were people who chose not to vote for either Harris or Trump because of the Israel issue, which to me was also very interesting and I'd never heard before. People who see voting as a serious obligation. And so that's at the anecdotal level.
All right, so I'll ask one more question, looking ahead, and then we'll open it up, because I know some of you have questions, and we already received some stuff via email. Looking ahead, right, we tried to establish, I think, what happened and why it happened. And again, I think we only touched the tip of the iceberg. But looking ahead, a lot of people are nervous. You said alert. right? Some are terrified. If you've seen the guy appointed, right, Matt Gaetz, appointed to be Attorney General, that's good reason to be terrified. But nevertheless, the question is, and Naama, I want to start with you, right? You're a legal historian. Much has been said about the lack of guardrails, right? The fact that, Trump controls the Senate, Republicans, they control the House, slim majority, they control the courts by, unfortunately, 6-3, that's dominating the court. In a way, looking forward, what guardrails or protections do you think we still have, or the United States has, to prevent Trump in case he tries to go off the deep end, which he might not. But are you nervous about that? And if not, why?
Absolutely. I think, you were talking about the 6-3 majority in the U.S. Supreme Court, and we have to keep in mind that during his presidency, he could end up
at least one.
Exactly, appointing at least one, if not two. The two that are expected to be replaced are conservative justices, but keeping in mind that
I think she's over 80, isn't she?
right, but I mean, there's a lot of talk about Clarence Thomas as well, and there's Alito as well. So, replacing someone who is a conservative justice with someone who is also conservative, but perhaps 30 years younger, might leave us with a Supreme Court that is leaning conservative or deep into conservatism for a very long time. I think that one of the things that we don't discuss a lot after these elections is the ballot measures that were passed in different states, and 10 states in the United States had different ballot measures that dealt with reproductive rights. 7 of them passed. So that might be an interesting point to look at and to think about if the Supreme Court wants states to have the jurisdiction over these questions of reproductive rights. So maybe the right way for people to operate would be through the states. That does not mean that we haven't seen a lot of also legislation that was going in a different direction of preventing abortions in different states since the Dobbs ruling in 2022. But I think that some of the movement within the states could also be indicative of the guardrails being actually in the states and not necessarily in the federal system. I think Florida is a really interesting case. The ballot measure there didn't pass, but it received 55% of the votes instead of 60, which was what was required, and still 56. 57. Oh, right. 57. Sorry. Thank you. 57. So, and the required threshold was 60.
The ballot initiative was
to enshrine reproductive rights. So, in a sense, we have a state that went for Trump, but also voters who were voting for reproductive rights as it comes with the ballot measures. So I think that we should keep in mind that these questions could be debated and discussed in on state level. The question of what Congress would do with reproductive rights could potentially be a terrifying one for anyone interested in reproductive rights, because all of these state level initiatives wouldn't really matter if there's a federal ban on abortions, but that remains to be seen. I think that the legal system is truly the one system that we have to, a lot of people, when they look at the re-election of Donald Trump, are saying, well, it will be for 4 years, and then after 4 years, whatever happens, happens. But the legal system is where I think a lot of the long-term repercussions will be. So sadly, I don't have an optimistic outlook on what the guardrails would be. But maybe the state level will be the solution. I'd also like to say, we look at Dobbs as, at least some people think of Dobbs as a surprise.
Just remind
Dobbs is the Supreme Court ruling that overturned Roe v. Wade and pretty much opened the door for many states to reenact laws that prohibit abortions within their boundaries, and so it happened in the last 2 years. A lot of people think of Dobbs as a surprise, but it's the culmination of 50 years of activism and a movement that was trying to roll back Roe v. Wade. So we should keep in mind that maybe the solutions will not be for anyone interested in people regaining reproductive rights as part of federal protection. It might not be short-term solutions, but in the long run, there are ways to go.
Brandon, do you think allies and the alliances provide a certain guardrail?
Yes and no. It depends on the issue. I was going to take the guardrail issue in a different direction, which is that during the first term, one of the first foreign policy issues that the Trump administration explored was called a Marshall Plan for the Middle East that was pushed by Michael Flynn, who was the very brief, I think he was only National Security Advisor for Trump for almost less than a month. But Flynn had a whole infrastructure of support for this idea of providing nuclear energy to the Saudis and others in the Gulf. And it was quite clear that what the Saudis and others were asking for was for the Trump administration to lift any safeguards or on how those civilian nuclear programs would be used. So the 1, 2, 3 clauses of the U.S. 1954 Atomic Energy Act, which says the U.S. exercises some degree of control if it transfers nuclear technology to friends and partners, is typically something that any presidential administration has to deal with if it's going to transfer things like nuclear technology to another country. I could see in an instance where the Trump administration is working on a grand bargain with the Saudis to normalize relations with Israel, somehow get a path to Palestinian statehood. One of the things the Saudis have been asking of the United States is to provide them with the nuclear fuel cycle. And potentially with both houses of Congress firmly Republican, and the Trump administration could modify what it needs to modify with respect to the Atomic Energy Act and provide the Saudis with the nuclear fuel cycle. So that's an issue where guardrails are sort of loosened, right? In order to provide an ally with what the Trump administration will argue will be a win-win, right? Because you get a path to Palestinian statehood, Israel-Saudi normalization, both sound great, right? And the Saudis get a U.S. defense pact and nuclear assistance. But in Israel, there are national security people with far more knowledge and experience than me who have grave concerns about Saudi Arabia with the nuclear fuel cycle. And so these issues are very complicated, right?
That's a checkmate. If they do that, Israel's going to be a very difficult response.
Right. And so there are a range of issues. When I said contradictions, paradoxes, these issues are complicated. On the face of it, this kind of grand bargain might be appealing to various constituencies, both in Israel, the United States, and certainly in the Arab world and Muslim world. But the question is, do they make us safer? Are they sound? And are the details the kind of details we can live with? And Udi's point about the devil is in the details is important here. So I would just say that the guardrails issue is tremendously important. And I would say it's not entirely clear.
Do you think?
Yeah, so a few thoughts about guardrails. So I think the reason why we think about guardrails so much is because emotions are so central in the experience of people here, people in America. So I want to talk about 3 emotions, okay? I want to talk about hope. I want to talk about ambition, hope, and fear, okay? So ambition, I recommend, if you haven't yet, I would recommend that you watch the victory speech of Donald Trump, okay? The person that I saw there is a person who's very, very ambitious, okay? He wants to leave his mark on history. He feels like in 2020, he felt like, he was denied the chance to do that with the second term. He felt that, he's now able to do that. And, you know, if you ask me, I don't think the Middle East or Ukraine is the big thing for him. I think it's China and not Taiwan. It's China, right? It's whether it's going to be the Chinese century or whether it's going to be the, again, an American century or even the Trump, you know, half century. But you saw a very, very ambitious person, not bitter, okay, not vindictive in his victory speech. Okay, watch the victory speech. Yeah. No, the victory speech is important. You know, something happens once you win. It's very different. You run a very tough campaign. Things can happen afterwards. Second thing is about hope. I think that we tended to characterize the Trump campaign as a dark campaign. I mean, if you read the New York Times, this is what you read, right? It's a dark campaign, etc. Versus the Harris campaign, which was a campaign about hope and about the future and, you know, light versus dark, etc. I think for tens of millions of people in America, this was the exact opposite. Making America great again, listening to their identity, understanding them was the hopeful message, okay? The message that Harris, and it's not just Harris, right? It's the liberal progressive movement had for them was a sense that, you know, if somebody says that your country is an island of garbage, then you should change your vote. Nobody would expect that from a white voter. Nobody, right? So why would you expect that from somebody from Puerto Rico or from, for that matter, from any Latino, right? So the experience of, I think the Trump campaign was, you know, the emotional, the positive emotional components there were largely not covered by much of the media that many of us read. But if you go beyond that and try to understand what drove people, this was a major motivation. And then last, about fear. So we talked a lot about uncertainty. I think Trump purposefully put in his cabinet opposing forces, okay? And he will need to listen to those different forces and make the decisions. And that's going to be very different from an Obama style, you know, which is a professorial style. You go into, you read all the briefs and you learn on the material and then you make a decision based on that. It's going to be very different from the Biden style, which has, you know, you have an experience of 50 years in public service, and based on that experience, you or that experience guides you when you make decisions. For Trump, it is going to be about his intuition. He's not going to go into the material. He doesn't have that much experience, okay? Relatively limited experience compared to Biden, of course, okay? But his intuition is very strong, and what that is, the kind of emotion that is going to generate, I think, among people, for instance, in the region, okay, is a sense of fear. Because when there's when it's about intuition, when you can't really predict that it's going to be based on, and again, everything that I talk about is emotions, right? Which is the opposite of rational thinking, okay? In the university, we used to thinking about, you know, to think that, you know, that's the right way to go, but turns out that many people don't feel that way, okay? And Trump is certainly not going to operate that way. It's going to be about his intuition, and once he operates based on that intuition, then the Iranians are not sure when they're going to cross the line or not. And same thing for Hezbollah, and same thing potentially even for China, maybe. So I think this sense of a cabinet and even a political party, if you look at the Republican Party, right, which is so dominant because all the constitutional guardrails are irrelevant because they control all the branches of government. Even the party has diverse and even opposing currents, and Trump will have to maneuver and make those decisions, and that's going to be based only on his intuition, which is going to create uncertainty and I think fear that may be a good thing in the international system.
So it's interesting, right? Just everyone here mentioned one way or another just this idea of federalism and maybe the states, right? Maybe that's the place, you know, maybe New York, California, whatever, that's where certain rights can be preserved. And of course, the irony is that we're entering an age where states' rights, which has always been the great conservative cause, right, against the federal government since the New Deal, now states' rights is being, and it's being appropriated. And we've seen that, right, in Gavin Newsom in California and in New York, and it's very interesting that how American history, the ironies really of American history, how it flips and it evolves. All right, so we have 20 minutes left. I left 20 minutes. The room is yours, right? This is for questions. We have some, I received emails also from people watching, but I wanted to open it up to the room here.
The room is yours, but ask us about gender, because we haven't spoken about the politics of gender.
Yeah, and specific questions? Yeah, please.
Actually, my question is specifically for Professor Sommer. You talked about how the minority groups, you can say that in all minority groups, they agree with Trump about what he says about themselves. So do we know, do you have any idea or any thought about why that is? Because he said some horrendous stuff, but I can tell even from myself, from my Latino father, who agrees with him 100% about immigration as well. Like, what is the driven cause behind it?
So again, the best person to ask is in the back. His name is Idan Franco, okay? And we're going to publish a book, hopefully right before the inauguration, that's called The Emerging Republican Minorities. So you can find all the answers there, or at least the answers that we found. But I think probably you should talk to your father before you talk to me. But
I'm talking to
you're talking to him. And what is he saying?
That Trump, that he agrees with him about immigration, that he should deport all those people, that he's a strong leader, and also that he's good for Israel, and that is that people chose him. So if people chose him, they must agree with him. He must be a good president, and Harris/Biden must be a bad president.
Yeah, and the roots go way back. Even if you look at the African American community, right? There were African American thinkers who thought that African Americans should not be so engrossed with structural issues and should lift themselves. Each individual should prove themselves, etc. The same thing for Latinos, which some of the roots actually go beyond American politics and deal with things that are happening in Latin America. The immigrant experience is familiar from Latin America, right? We know about Venezuela, right? That's a great recent experience where so many people who used to live in Venezuela are not there anymore, right? They're elsewhere. Yeah, I think he was right on the money. He realized what those, not just your dad, but Trump. He was right on the money in terms of the priorities of those people, and not just the priorities. I think also those people were insulted by the way the liberal establishment and the progressive movement understood them and portrayed them in a way that diminished the way they identified themselves. And these are not outliers, okay? This is not just Clarence Thomas, Clarence Thomas. These are millions of people, and it just so happened that in places like Georgia and Nevada and some of the swing states, this is the population. Florida, for sure, okay? Florida is not a swing state anymore, partly because of that. There's other reasons, okay? But it just so happened that what we see manifested itself so clearly and so quickly because it's a swing state. And one last point, we did not talk about demographics, but those three groups are the groups that are growing the fastest in America. Asian Americans is the fastest growing group, and Latinos and blacks as well, much faster than the white population. Okay, the white population was 90% in the 1960s. It's about 60% now, and it's going to be a plurality by mid-century. So those trends are important because of their geographic locations and the political implications, and also because of the demography, because demography matters.
Just in the back, yeah, please.
Yeah, so I have a few questions for Professor Sommer. Then maybe for Professor Sommer, I noticed that you mentioned both Hispanics and Asians. A lot of the Hispanics were from Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua. Trump was very, very, very harsh on those three countries' regimes, and how much of the support amongst Latin Americans was because of the fact that he was harsh on the regime versus he was harsh on immigration. And the same question applies to the Chinese people as well that voted for him, because a lot of Chinese people don't like their.
So we talked a lot about Latinos. I'll answer that with respect to the Asian Americans, but just to say about about what's going to happen, the fact that Marco Rubio is the Secretary of State, right, and he comes from Florida himself, from Hispanic descent, from Cuban descent. It's interesting what's going to happen there. But let's just talk about the Asian Americans. So what we find for Asian Americans, overwhelmingly so for Chinese Americans, which is the largest group. Mexican Americans are the largest groups among Latinos. Chinese Americans are the largest among Asians. Is that if you look at what drove them to vote for Trump, again, it was ideology and the state of the economy. That's always true. Okay, that's the null hypothesis. But also, it was their sentiment towards China. So the more xenophobic they were, the more likely they were to vote for Trump. So in other words, the fact that Trump maybe wasn't that tough on China, but at least he tried to portray himself as being very tough on China, imposing tariffs, etc., that actually mobilized them and made them vote for him in bigger numbers in 2020 compared to 2016. We don't have the data for 2024 yet, but overall, if you read the press coverage, it seems like it was even more so for 2024.
But xenophobia means anti-Chinese people, not anti-Chinese government, right?
Not in the way those questions are framed in the questionnaires, but we can talk about the details later.
Yeah, please.
I have a question for Dr. Maor. So, please, can you tell me, why did women at the end, voted for Trump, and also, concerning gender issues, what does it mean for American policy, and also, for the cooperation in gender issues with other states?
Right, thank you. I mentioned the 2016 election and the kind of the sense that we won't get to see another woman running for president for a very long time, and I can only imagine how some people feel post the 2024 election and the possibility of the American people electing a woman president. I think we have to keep in mind that just as we don't necessarily think of different minority voters as one issue voters, the same we can think about women. They don't necessarily vote. A lot of people expected women to vote for the Democratic Party because of its support for reproductive rights, because of its support for women's issues, for gender equality. But for a lot of women who did end up supporting Donald Trump, other questions were at the front of their consciousness. I mean, some of them were looking at the economy and the cost of living and then the ways in which their families were struggling. Some of them, I think don't necessarily endorse the idea of a woman being president themselves. And I think we have to kind of live with that notion as well, and knowing that not all women are necessarily comfortable with a woman leading their country, and some of the gender ideology that prevents men from voting for a woman for president also prevents women from voting. I think one of the most interesting campaign ads that we saw, I don't know how many of you have seen them. I think the Harris campaign released an ad with Julia Roberts as kind of the narrator, but there's also a similar one from the Lincoln Project. And both of these ads were depicting women going to the polls with their husbands and whispering between them that they're voting for Kamala Harris and not for Trump. And the idea was that it's okay to keep your vote a secret. It's okay to not tell your husband what you're voting.
Woman to woman.
Yeah, exactly. There's an alliance between women, and we don't have to share everything. And some of the pollsters that I was listening to before the elections were talking about the difference between mail-in voters and voters who actually show up to the polls, and we're talking about how women felt freer voting in the polls as opposed to mail-in votes, because sometimes their husbands can see what they're voting. They can look at their ballot. They can see who they're supporting. So in that sense, it kind of creates certain rifts within the household. But we have to keep in mind that women's issues, what is defined as women's issues, are not necessarily the issues that are in the forefront of most women's minds. And we also have to keep in mind, when we talk about gender, we have to think about how masculinity was deployed during these elections, how manhood was talked about and described, how Trump and his allies were able to appeal to primarily non-college educated young white male voters who were in a lot of ways felt neglected, left behind, abandoned. I mean, we can use a lot of
left behind by women, right? One of the things we know this, we know that women do better, in terms of education today in the workplace, right? They have adapted to the post-industrial economy in a more successful manner. Trump understands that. He understands the rage the disappointment, the emasculinity. Emasculinity is a very important driving force in history, not only in America. And he understood that, and that's why. And you saw he went to Joe Rogan. He did all the bro stuff, with all those what's it called, all those podcasts, and right, Ultimate Fighting Championship, right. And that's it. But that's it. That's that crowd that hasn't done as well as women, and you have that resentment. And then
But I think there's also a strategic mistake made by Kamala Harris. She was. If you think about two strategies the Democrats used, right? Obama didn't say anything about the fact that he was black in 08, right? It was a complete secret until there was this, the one case where he talked about his black identity with respect to this reverend, right? That I don't remember his last name.
Jeremiah,
And then Jeremiah, right? You're right. And then Hillary did the exact opposite, right? I'm with her, right? She's a woman. She's going to be the first woman president. And what Kamala Harris chose in 2024 was to go for the Obama strategy, right? She wasn't, obviously she said she was black, and when they asked her if she was a woman, she said, obviously I'm a woman. This was her answer, but this was not an issue, right? She did not run on that at all, okay? So, and in that sense, she did not generate gender politics or the politics of gender as a major issue. And, if you look at 2022, the midterm elections, the reason why there was no red wave in the midterm elections, and we have big data proof to show that, okay, is Dobbs, okay? The fact that women were raised and they registered to vote and they voted for Democrats, and this, Biden his approval ratings were miserable at the time, okay? And that, many people thought that this was going to happen in 2024, and it did not, because I think there was a major strategic mistake by the campaign. That's one thing, and the other thing is that, and that requires research. I don't want to say things, off the top of my head, but I think there's a good reason that for many women, the issue of reproductive rights is not really a big issue. So Kamala Harris brought those stories during the campaign of this woman, bleeding in the parking lot of the hospital, and these are heartbreaking stories, of course. But there's a good chance that for the majority of women in America, given the way people do abortions today, which is taking pills, Dobbs is not anymore. In 2022, it was all fresh. Nobody knew, what would be the consequences. 2 years later, 2.5 years later, maybe for most women in America, that is not there. There's issues about gender, about the politics of gender, but that's not the issue. And the campaign completely missed on that as well. So
I have a question here for Brandon, and I'll take one more, right? And then we'll finish. So one's to Brandon about the Middle East, and it's about the Arab world, right? And do you think that America's Arab, I'm assuming they mean Sunni allies like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, do they prefer Trump over Harris, or who do you think they wanted in that sense to win?
I think in the Gulf, they wanted Trump.
Emiratis, kind of.
And I think that there's a sense of comfort with Trump's naked transactionalism, which is familiar to them. But in reading the Arab media over the last few days, it's interesting. I think their expectations, there are huge gaps between perhaps what their expectations are and how Trump might seek to fulfill them. I think they're expecting Trump to end the wars in Gaza and Lebanon. I think they want to see Trump pursue a policy in the Middle East that's heavy on diplomacy, that doesn't sort of open a new round of conflict with Iran. And so I think that there is also, particularly in the Gulf, this view that the culture wars, particularly what was happening in the West on campuses around the issue of the war in Gaza, is not something they like to see. And
why? Because of all the money that's is revealed that they've been.
No, I think for them it's a source of instability, and instability is something they greatly fear. And I'll just give you an example. In Saudi Arabia, 2/3 of the population is under 30. Many of them had no living memory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the way that their fathers and grandfathers did. And sorry for saying grandfathers, mothers and grandmothers as well. And so therefore, it wasn't a living memory. And now, over the last year, they've seen many of them on a day-to-day basis the conflict playing out, in a way that probably doesn't work in the favor of their regimes that have taken a moderate line towards the war, or tried to, or in Israel's favor. And a country like the Emirates that's worked very hard prior to October 7th in promoting religious tolerance sees what's happening in the West as being the very antithesis of what they've trying to work towards to, which is moderate their society, marginalize radicals. The war, in their view, has empowered radicals both at home and abroad. And so I think one of the things they're keen to see is Trump pursue a line that will, I guess, douse the flames of the culture wars. And I think that expectation may be unreasonable given what we've seen from Trump in the last few days.
Final question.
I have I don't know if kind of politically correct question, but basically, as you guys have mentioned, there's like a rise in more intuition politics and a fall of more, I'd say, educated or rational politics, at least at the top. And it's also kind of hard to ignore the education difference between the voter bases of the Republican and Democrat Party. And I want to ask the question, like, is everyone stupid? Obviously I don't think that everyone is stupid, but the Democrats are frowning upon these Republicans that were supposed to have voted for them. But, like, do they just not know better? Or, like, what do you think? How do you explain that? Like, this goes to all of you, whoever can answer.
Is the question, are the Democrats stupid or?
Yeah.
No, they might also be stupid, but
I mean, when I hear your question, I hear it in terms of elites, right? And this is one of the big dividing lines, as I understand it, in American politics these days, right? The notion that, particularly in the Democratic Party, that the elites are out of touch, right? I don't know how true that is, but that's sort of one of the lines of self-criticism you're hearing in the wake of the elections, is that American elites, particularly liberal elites, are out of touch with the vast majority of their population. And so if you turn your question around, the question, I suppose those who are sort of educated and rational should be asking themselves, why is it that they're so out of touch with the vast majority of their fellow citizens? And I don't purport to have an answer to that question, but I would say that that's a serious question worth asking. And I'll just leave it at that.
I'll just say something. I think that, the question of stupidity is not just about the elites. The real question is whether are the masses stupid, right? Women are voting for those ballot measures, but then they voted for Trump. Are they stupid? Don't they understand the way policy works? And I think people are not stupid at all. I think that the liberal and the progressive agenda that was pushed so hard in recent years actually missed the real, I think that one of the key motivations is human suffering, right? The human suffering of minorities, the human suffering of women, the human suffering of LGBTQ, the human suffering of trans people, okay? But that became an agenda that was so convoluted, okay, that it missed some of the real sources of human suffering, okay? That Trump was actually able to trace. The fact that Trump was able to understand the tens of millions of blue-collar white people who felt that their lives were over. I don't know how many people are here in their 40s or 50s, okay? But when you're in your 40s or 50s and your town becomes a ghost town because of industrialization, because of automation, because of globalization, and you know that it's never going to come back, and you don't have the time to reinvent yourself, this is a cause for deep human suffering, okay? Just as much as somebody who thinks about their sexual identity or their sexual orientation, okay? I'm not trying to demean any of those, but this is equally important. These were tens of millions of people, okay? Compare that to the percentage of people who identify as trans in the population. That's way, way smaller, okay? And again, I'm not saying which suffering is more important. I'm just saying that this was completely missed by people who were supposedly, allegedly driven by being attentive to what people, how people feel, how people suffer, and that the government should be there for them, okay? And Trump was there. So what I said earlier about hope, I think he gave hope. He's giving hope to those people because they feel that he listens to them, he understands them, and he tells them, I'm going to make America great again for you, the way you think about America, how America should be great. So in that sense, I think, there's lots of stupidity, never underestimate people's intelligence and never underestimate their stupidity. I think it goes both ways. There's stupidity on both sides, and a lot of intelligence on both.
So on that, there's stupidity on both sides. It's a good way for us to conclude. We're out of time. So first of all, thank you for the panel. And thank you, everyone. And again, I want to urge you to check out all the events from the Tau America Week. And I have on Thursday, if you like it, Gal Keret, the writer, right? I'm talking to him in my class Thursday morning at 10 in Web 001. And there's a lot of other stuff in between. So, have a great week.